let's dive right into this explainer. Because today, we're going to completely flip a massive assumption you probably have about how the world works. Specifically, we're looking at how we measure human well-being and self-worth in professional environments. We usually divide the business world into two very neat buckets. On one side, you have hard, measurable data, and on the other, you have the soft, kind of unquantifiable human feelings. But what if that whole distinction is completely obsolete? Today, we're going to look at some hard data that proves our traditional, standard ways of measuring the human psyche are just fundamentally flawed. So let me ask you a quick question. If you strongly agree with the statement, I feel confident and positive about myself, does that automatically mean you have healthy self-acceptance? Now, most corporate HR departments, standard psychological surveys, and honestly, probably most of us would just immediately answer yes to that. We've built entire corporate well-being frameworks around this idea, assuming that absolute certainty is the ultimate benchmark of mental health. We treat strong self-acceptance as this static, fixed checkbox. But is it really? Well, here is the hard data that completely shatters that assumption. Negative 0.1514. Now, I know it's just a number, but this is a massive, statistically significant negative correlation. And while it doesn't imply direct causation, it shows us something fascinating. Highly developed, incredibly complex thinkers actually reject absolute self-confidence. When they get that statement about feeling completely confident, the folks operating at the absolute highest levels of systemic awareness actually say no. They disagree. And that completely breaks our standard model of how confidence is supposed to work. To really grasp this, we need to look at where this anomaly is coming from, because this is not just some tiny localized study. This data is pulled from the SDTEST, relying on the incredibly well-respected psychological well-being poll by Carol D. Ryff. We are talking about a globally recognized phenomenon here, tracking across 87 countries and 22 different languages, with nearly 2,000 responses. It easily meets all the strict statistical reliability checks. And the big finding? It connects that strongly agree option on self-acceptance negatively to what spiral dynamics theory calls the yellow vMEME stage. Okay, so what exactly is a yellow vMEME? Basically, it's a stage of psychological development where a person views the world through the lens of systemic complexity. People operating in this yellow stage see their identity as entirely contextual. It depends on the system they're in. So the absolute crucial takeaway here is that this negative correlation isn't low self-worth at all, not even close. It is actually the yellow complexity filter realizing that forcing a highly evolved, dynamic human identity into a simple yes or no box is just way too reductive. They aren't lacking confidence, they are literally rejecting the oversimplification of the question itself. And this isn't a one-off fluke. When we look at over 13,000 statistical correlations, a brilliant, consistent pattern emerges. The yellow mindset constantly pushes back against rigid, static metrics across literally every facet of psychological well-being. Whether we're talking about self-acceptance, finding your purpose in life, or even having positive relationships, the correlation is universally negative if the question demands an absolute, categorical answer. To the yellow mindset, all of these things are flowing, dynamic processes. They are not fixed destinations that you just arrive at and check off a list. This right here is exactly where the whole system fractures when we try to force complex human psychology into standard HR checkboxes. Just think about it. One identical input literally creates three completely divergent realities. Someone in the blue stage looks at the question and sees a necessary, clear benchmark for self-assessment. Someone in the green stage uses it as an opportunity to affirm their self-worth to build community connection. But our yellow thinker, they lose their nuance anchor. They read it as a totally reductive trap, and they just disengage. So if you're using one universal survey to measure your organization's health, you are fundamentally misreading your most complex thinkers. Now, you might be wondering, why does this matter to me? Well, when you strip away the actual nuance of human psychology, the fallout isn't usually some huge, dramatic explosion. Instead, it's a quiet, silent drift. First, you oversimplify the metric. Then, your most complex thinkers disengage because of that reductive framing. That leads straight to metric drift in your self-reported data. So suddenly, your HR dashboards might be glowing bright green, telling you everybody is absolutely thriving, while your entire support system is quietly misaligning, targeting the totally wrong problems, because it's completely blind to reality. To actually fix this massive misalignment, we have to completely zoom out. We've got to abandon that old mechanical view of management. The chainsaw approach, where you treat a company like a factory machine and just cut out a cog to save a salary. We need to transition to treating a company like a living, breathing, complex organism. And in this new world, organizational transitions depend heavily on invisible metrics. We have to start measuring the deep psychological profiles of our teams, their fears, their trust, their empathy, and their stress levels. Which introduces us to something absolutely mind-blowing called the algebra of conscience. This is a rigorous, dynamic programming model that literally turns the messy, unpredictable soul of an organization into a solvable, predictive mathematical equation. The future psychological state of your company, S of T plus 1, is calculated as a function of its current state, your management actions, and the surrounding context. It's wild, but it actually allows us to mathematically track how individual, personal well-being scales all the way up to systemic organizational health. But here's the catch. To make an equation like that work, you need incredibly accurate sensors. You can't just measure the top layer of visible actions, like who clocked in on time or who hit their quota. Those are lagging indicators. By the time productivity drops, your employee has already mentally quit. To truly hit the bullseye of human motivation, this framework uses a multidimensional vector that measures 5 distinct psychological layers. We're talking about everything from their deep motivations to their trust in leadership to internal burnout, all the way down to base-level demographic and structural barriers. Let's put this into perspective with a real-world scenario. Let's look at a specific management action, mandating unpaid vacation. Normally, you'd think taking money away is universally hated by everyone, right? But look at the data. A purple tribal mindset actually accepts this positively as a shared ritual sacrifice so the group survives. A green community mindset also accepts it, but out of solidarity to save a coworker's job. But an orange, results-driven achiever, they reject it entirely as a career roadblock and will probably update their resume that afternoon. The exact same management action will literally save one company and completely destroy another, entirely depending on its hidden psychological wiring. And the cascade of secondary effects here is what we call the butterfly effect, and it gets pretty terrifying. Imagine you pull the lever to reduce staff. Your spreadsheet says, great job, you just saved $2 million. But the algebra of conscience tracks the psychological ripple effect. First, the layoffs trigger a massive spike in fear. That fear fractures the culture. It destroys trust, obviously, but astoundingly, the correlations show it also heavily increases ageism, as older and younger generations basically turn on each other to survive. All of this culminates in a total crash in your leadership legitimacy. Your spreadsheet was totally blind to the fact that you just mathematically destroyed your own authority. So how on earth do we navigate this future? Enter AI vibe coding. This is a massive rising trend where users instruct AI in plain, natural language to build complex behavioral tools without any traditional coding. Because let's be real, a human brain just cannot compute 13,000 statistical correlations at once. We use tools built via AI prompts to input a potential action, like mandating remote work, and the AI runs the simulation. It predicts those butterfly effects, calculating a stability metric known as the J-score. It helps you find the exact optimal path that strengthens the organization without breaking the underlying human empathy. I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to mull over as we wrap up this explainer. If an organization is truly a living, breathing organism, what actually breaks inside it when we force incredibly nuanced human self-worth into rigid, static metrics? And beyond that, if an algorithm can compute these deep psychological complexities, predict our fears, and accommodate our need for trust even better than a human manager ever could, is empathy finally becoming a computable science? Thanks for diving into this with us today. Always remember to look beyond the checkbox, and we'll catch you on the next explainer.